Welcome to the Understanding Boys podcast. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which this podcast is recorded, the Boonwurrung people of the Kulin Nation. We pay our respects to their leaders past, present and emerging. The Understanding Boys podcast is a series of conversations exploring what it is to be a good man these days. And if you had a story that you could tell a boy of, say, 14 and he'd listen, what would that story be? And that's really what I'm asking our guests today. I'm Dr. Ray Swan, and we're a community of teachers and parents concerned with the education and growth of boys and young men in the modern world. This series is brought to you by Brighton Grammar, an all-boys school in Melbourne. To learn more about the podcast, please visit understandingboys.com.au. In our conversation today, I speak with Ross Featherston. Ross is the 8th headmaster of Brighton Grammar School, a school in Melbourne, Australia. It's also the school that brings us the Understanding Boys podcast. Since his time starting as head in 2014, Ross has brought about positive change in pretty much every domain of the school. He's loved by parents, by his staff and also the kids. And in our conversation, we talk about his wisdom and understanding about how to raise boys. He gives us some great takeaways and also talks about what it's like to be a parent. We hope you enjoy the conversation today. Joining us today on the Understanding podcast is Headmaster Ross Featherston. Ross, thanks for joining us.
It's a pleasure, Ray. Great to be here. I've been wondering when you're going to invite me on. We've had these fantastic guests for a number of years now, and I'm just been sitting on the bench. But here we are. It's great. Hopefully, I can maybe give the listeners a tidbit or two to go away with.
Oh, there's no doubt about that. And of course, we do like to say it's Series 1, and we have kept the very best till last. So that's why you're sitting there in that position. So all good.
Well done.
I thought a good place to start for us, Ross, is, about headship. It's a role I think that a lot of us, as kids growing up, we sort of had the school principal and we sort of knew that, she or he, was in charge of the teachers and sort of did a lot of speaking. But of course, these days, school headship is really different. There's so many parts to it. There's complexities. You're a leader. You're a leader in the community, and you're balancing out a lot. If you were just to explain to the folks that are listening, what is it like for you to be a head these days?
Yeah, it's a good question. I saw something on LinkedIn, I think, where a primary school student had drawn a picture of the principal's role, that he makes all the announcements and then goes and eats donuts. There's a bit more to it than that. Look, it's an incredibly rewarding job. I mean, when I set out to be a teacher, I didn't necessarily set out to be a principal or a headmaster, but it's an incredibly rewarding job because ultimately you're working with young people. It's a cliche, but you are shaping their futures. And it's if ever I'm having a bad day, I just wander over to the junior school and go and open the door to a prep classroom. So it is incredibly rewarding, but as you say, it is challenging at the same time. Everyone's been to school at some stage in their life, so everyone's got an opinion as to how a school should be running. But it's about managing stakeholders. There's obviously the business side of it, which sits there and is very, very important because you want to run it from an operational, financial perspective as well as you possibly can. I heard or read this from, I think, a military leader about leading in leading in three phases: the past, the present, and the future. We're 138 years old. We've got a tremendous history. So there's an element of leading, in respecting that past and that heritage of the school and honouring that. And I think our boys respond really well to that. We've got a great old boy community and network, and they need to be looked after and cared for want of a better term. And obviously the present is very, very important, making sure that we're preparing the boys, in the here and the now, and our year 12s are leaving and going off and doing great things when they leave school, making sure that everything is running well in the present. But then there's the future, and it's a great challenge to, educate for future. I often tell prospective parents, we've got boys here who are 3 years old. They'll be touching the 21st, the 22nd century with their work, so they'll be working until 2070, 2080. And we've got to prepare those. They're here. These boys are at our school now, and we've got to prepare them for that future. So it is a fantastic job. It's a privilege, as you said. You genuinely are leading a community, and I think these days more so than perhaps 20, 30, 40 years ago, people are looking to schools like ours as pillars of the community, if you like, to show leadership in a whole bunch of different ways. So it is a genuine privilege and honour to do that. And as I said, it's rewarding, but it has its moments, that's for sure, Ray.
I'm sure it does. And I guess, sometimes, like anything that's got a presence in the community, you're held up to scrutiny sometimes, more perhaps than you might think is fair or that is right, that sometimes kids and kids by their nature will make mistakes, and sometimes, schools are held to account and sometimes rightly so as well. But it certainly all goes into the mix of things that as a head you need to, you need to deal with and to be that figurehead and that sort of like, to use the James Kerr analogy of the spearhead, sort of you're leading and you're sort of absorbing a lot of those things at various times. And I guess no more so than the current period that we've been in with COVID and having to, as everybody says, the buzzword these days is pivot, take a whole school of 138 years old and then put it all online. How's that been?
Yeah, it's been it's been challenging and difficult. There's no doubt about that. But, for us, like a lot of schools, really proud of the work that our staff have done, the ability for all of our teachers and our professional support staff as well to get behind what we're trying to do. I think society, community, particularly here in Melbourne, because we've been doing it for a while, probably respects teachers more so, which is a good byproduct out of this. And as you know, Ray, we're looking at things to do. What can we learn from this when we go back to, in inverted commas, a normal schooling system, better use of technology. How can we, I think Winston Churchill said, never waste a good crisis. So whilst we, as I said before, concentrating on the here and the now, we're also got a little bit of an eye to the future.
And what are some of the challenges? If I was a parent listening and, I've got kids that are sort of in those early years and, and they're in the story realm and that play space, but then I'm kind of got one eye looking ahead and thinking, boy, we've just seen so many disruptions, obviously, with COVID, and opportunities, and we're already coming off a fairly unstable, change piece anyway with what technology is doing. What are some of the things that that you're looking at in casting your mind forward to the future?
Yeah, we alluded to the challenges earlier in this chat. I think I'm a bit of a knowledge purist, and I know you are as well. We can't disregard knowledge in the pursuit of skills. I firmly believe, we've got to skill the kids up, skill the students, the boys and the girls up for the future. But I don't think that can be done without a good knowledge base. So I think that we still need to teach knowledge for knowledge's sake, not necessarily knowledge for the sake of going on and getting a particular job. I think that remains, and that's being eroded a little bit, I think, out there, that knowledge is not so important, but let's just skill kids up for the 21st century and that sort of stuff. That's the first thing I'd say. The second thing I'd say is the mental health picture, the mental health aspect. We're very keen on it here. I'm personally very, very keen on ensuring that our students are mentally healthy, because we know that the challenges out there today, when we left school, Ray, we're sort of the same vintage. The challenges probably weren't as great as what they are now. Around social media, around high expectations, about don't fail, don't make mistakes, those sorts of things. So I think resilience and adaptability and being able to, these are buzzwords, but I genuinely believe that these are the sorts of things we've got to, again, inverted commas, very broadly teach the kids. So there's the mental health side of it. That's the second thing, and I think the third thing is, and I've touched on it a little bit, is that that skill-based acquisition. The workforce has changed tremendously. I think will change again as a result of COVID. And, kids need to be they need to be good communicators. They need to be good collaborators. They need to be good. It's the C's, isn't it? Good be creative, and collaborate, as I said. So it's really skilling those kids up for that, but making sure that those skills, as I said before, are built on a foundation of knowledge, because I don't think you can have those skills without having the knowledge base that I think still exists. So it's a challenge, but it's really exciting. I think it's exciting preparing the kids for the future. And in any school, whether it's ours or other schools or, other parts of the world and that sort of stuff, it's about those three or four things that I've just mentioned. I think listeners, don't be afraid of that. I think we've got to embrace it and And as my grandma would say, just do your best. But it's exciting. Yeah.
And in that space, I guess, with what you're saying with the knowledge, there's also there's different kinds of knowing as well, isn't there? And I guess, something that I've heard you talk a lot about over the years is, just the importance of young men and values, and that they have a real sense of who they are and where they're going.
Yep. Yeah. I mean, yeah, at the end of the day, you've got to find your true north, and you've got to be true to yourself and comfortable in your own skin. And values are critical, and values of time, they will stand the test of time, won't they? Doesn't, the values of the ancients and those sorts of things, and were there, and they're still here. And I'd like to think that they'll still be around for another 100 and 200, 300, 400 years, though. That values based, you can never deviate or escape or water down the importance of a values-based education.
Absolutely. Do you think that there's particular challenges at the moment for boys that maybe sit outside of, challenges for other people?
I think that, and I know we're going to probably get to it a bit later on, what it means to be a good man, but I think that for, the role of boys, of young men, of men in society continues to change and evolve. And I think this generation of young men are probably in a bit of a transition phase. I think, Ray, when we were growing up, the role of the man, our dads and that sort of stuff was pretty, pretty defined in a way. And it wasn't, and it was big, perhaps starting to be challenged. Whereas I think now it's changed a lot and will continue to change. And rightly so. I firmly believe that, dad should get in and, unpack the dishwasher and do the ironing and, show emotion and cry and show their softer side and be authentic and be genuine and all that, and, embrace all the diversity and all that sort of stuff that's out there. Absolutely. And I think that, as I said, I think we're undergoing a bit of generational change in that space. I read something really fascinating about, Hollywood movies and the amount of lead roles that men take and the amount of lines men have and women don't. So it can be difficult for boys to sort of understand that. But I think, again, back to schools like ours, and, we're not the only one looking at it. Obviously, a lot of people are looking at it. I think that we've got a really important role to play to sort of address some of those things, so that when the boys do, transition into manhood and go out there and find their way and their space in the world, that they're across those sorts of things and they're very mindful and comfortable and, as I said before, happy in their own skin.
What are you seeing, Ross, in terms of, with some of these challenges for boys and, in this transition phase? And, what roles do you think parents can play in sort of speaking into that and enabling, boys to continue to grow as they sort of settle into the who they are?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, it goes without saying, doesn't it really? But parents play an absolutely critical and crucial role in the development of boys. And I'd encourage, any parents out there listening to this podcast to work with their schools, wherever their son or daughter is going to school, to work with them. Because if we, as I say all the time here, if we've got, we've got parents, families, and the school are in pretty good lockstep with each other, then the outcomes for the children are going to be much stronger. Whereas if the parents are heading one way and the school's heading another, then it's not really going to work. So that's the first thing I guess I'd mention. But parents these days, I've been in education now for 20, 25 years, I guess, and over that period of time, I've noticed, the role of parents changing, and I'm a parent myself. Parents are much busier these days. There's an element of trying to keep up. You've got to have the nice house and the nice car and the comforts of life, which I completely understand. That's not a criticism at all. But so parents are busy, they're working. There's more demands on people. So that can influence and impact, the time parents spend with their kids, the conversations parents spend with their kids. I think children are very perceptive. They pick up on things without things being spoken. So I'd encourage parents to be mindful of what their children are seeing. The amount of time, my wife would probably laugh at this, but the amount of time parents spend on their phones and these sorts of things whilst at home. But I think some of the traditional classic parent techniques or we know that things work. I think it's a bit like the values before, that sort of thing stands the test of time. Spending time with your children, listening to them, having open conversations, particularly as they go through maturation and develop and these sorts of things. It's being a parent. I'm a parent of four. It's not easy. And I think parenting is probably a little more complicated now than what it was that I mentioned before.
Absolutely. Yeah. So Ross, just back in the educational side, just for a moment. Obviously, over the journey, you've encountered a lot of teachers, and you were saying earlier about, people are starting to recognise some of the work that teachers do because it's much more visible now that everybody's at home, and you might have your child might be doing some work, but then as the parent, you're seeing them and you're seeing how they interact with the teachers. What are some of the best teachers that you've seen in terms of their qualities? What are they bringing?
Yeah, first and foremost, a really sound knowledge base, particularly secondary school teachers. You want your physics teacher to know his physics, and you want the Latin teacher to know her Latin. That's the first thing, and then it gets down to the traits that we know work. Particularly for us for boys, but I know we can talk more broadly here about boys and girls in terms of schooling. But a sense of humour, I think's really important for teachers to have. They need to understand their craft, because we know that some things in teaching work better than others. This is the pedagogy, the way a teacher teaches. So we want to make sure that our teachers actually have a good understanding of what actually does work in the classroom by way of learning. We want teachers to be collaborative, because traditionally teaching is a fairly closed off, singular type profession. The door gets closed in the classroom, but we want teachers to be collaborative and open to seeing how other teachers work and these sorts of things. And I think a really, really important thing that goes a long, long way is teachers who show an interest in their students outside of the classroom. So it's incredibly powerful when a particular football team a student might barrack for, or a concert the student did on the weekend or something like that. And just as you walk past them to say, "Oh, how did you go on the weekend?" Wow, that's not much perhaps for us as adults, as teachers, but for students, for children, it's little things like that go a long, long way. And there's a lot of research out there, as we know, that that tells us this, as I said before, this works, and this makes a good teacher, and this not so. The other thing, which is a little, listeners might find this a little surprising, I think students respond really well to a teacher who's firm but fair. So sometimes, we think, Mr. Smith or Mrs. Jones is popular because she's a bit slack or he's a bit slack, and they have a bit of a laugh in class, and, don't worry if you didn't hand your homework in. But I think the reverse is actually true. If a teacher is firm and follows through and has high expectations, students will generally respond better to that teacher than the teacher who is a little less rigid in terms of their expectations. So I think high expectations are really important in that as well.
It's interesting, isn't it, that, staff who can provide those boundaries, and often in the development of a young person, they're looking for where's the line here, where's the limit, and how do I meet that limit, and what kind of feedback am I getting? If I put my finger in there, does it go bang, or does it? And I think, a lot of us as teachers have had that experience, particularly in new contexts where you walk into a room and the kids don't know you, and they're just straight away you can feel, all the little testing comments and
they're checking you out, aren't they? Yeah, I remember when I started teaching, a great sort of mentor of mine in education said regarding boys, he said, boys need to know who's the boss, what are the rules, and what happens if you push those rules. And I thought, whilst that's a little simplistic, it's not a bad place to start, I think.
I love your predecessor, Michael Irwin. I think he wrote an article when he did some moonlighting at another school after his headship, and his article was titled "Don't You Know Who I Was?" I think it's something.
Yeah, that's very true.
You have to re.
I taught a history. I teach when I can. I taught a history class for a semester here, and I walked in first of all, and the boys were very quiet, very respectful, and I reckon me being the headmaster lasted for about half an hour, and then it quickly reverted back to me just being a normal everyday teacher, and they were testing things and my dog ate my homework, all that sort of stuff. So it's kind of nice. It's kind of nice, isn't it, that way?
It doesn't take long. It really doesn't take long. Just for things to be normal. And that's part of the beauty of teaching, isn't it? Is it's refreshing.
Absolutely.
That you've got to, every day you've got to show up, and every day you've got to really be able to focus on those things. And I think it's something that we think a lot about as teachers is not only, I guess, the subject knowledge, not only as you were saying, the pedagogy, the how, but also the environment of the class. Like you need to pay attention to that. Think about it like a garden. You've got to just do your maintenance every now and again. Your checks for understanding, and making sure that that sort of well-being line, in the group, that people know each other, and there's a culture of respect and belonging and those sorts of things as well.
Yeah, no doubt.
Ross, if I was a parent and thinking about like what are the kinds of programs that work really well. I've got a son and I'm thinking, oh, he's a sporty kid, or he's an art sort of student or whatever. And so perhaps outside of, the general things that you might expect to see in a school, what are some of the key programs that you think really help to develop well-rounded boys for our age?
Yeah, I think a school needs to have a range of these sorts of programs. Your traditional sport, music, drama type programs that allow boys to flourish, and it's the same with girls. Children, students finding something they're good at and something that they can really sink their teeth into and become passionate about, whether that's playing a violin or rowing in a boat or being a public speaker or whatever it is. I think we've got to provide opportunities for students to find a passion. If we just focus on academics, then it's not going to work. It's not going to develop that holistic education, that holistic development that we're after. That's the first thing I'd say. That there's got to be an array of opportunities for students to find their slot. Then I think it's about getting boys and girls outside of their comfort zone, whether that's taking them abseiling, rock. I'm a huge fan of outdoor ed, as you know, Ray, whitewater rafting, these sorts of things where it pushes students, pushes children, and same with teachers. When we go on camps ourselves, we get inside of our comfort zone a bit. So it gets them out of their comfort zone, gets them out of that natural environment, their normal environment, gets them to mix with other people that they wouldn't normally mix with. And even though some of those lessons they might not get immediately, I think as they develop and mature and leave school and become adults, they might look back and say, oh, yeah, I remember that year 9 camp I went on where I had to walk along the beach and it was really hot and I had to backpack. But, I got through it and I learned a lesson there. And it's those deeper lessons that I think are really, really important. So that's the other thing I'd say is about getting them outside of their comfort zone, outside of their environment, challenging them safely. Got to be safe when we do these sorts of things. We can't be cavalier with risk, but it's got to be done safely. Again, I guess that's another challenge, isn't it, in education, that we can't be completely risk averse to providing students with some of these experiences that we want. And the other thing I'd say about some of these programs, and I've kind of alluded to it just before, I think. And I know it's true of boys, and it would be true of girls, young girls as well, young students. Sometimes it's best when they don't realise what they're actually learning. Again, those lessons they might not understand. Why do I have to abseil down that cliff, or why do I have to get through this cave, or whatever the case is. But yeah, those lessons might come later. And the final thing I'd say about this is serving others. I think that's a really key part. The community service piece, helping out other people, because at the end of the day, that's what's life about. Well, life's about, serving something greater than yourself. So through all of these fantastic programs that schools like ours offer, I think there's got to be a community service component to it. There's got to be, and it's a genuine community service component. Handing over money and that sort of stuff is great because that can help, but if they're actually exposed and immersed in that community service, then I think that adds a really fantastic dimension to those programs that we're talking about.
Yeah, and I'm hearing, so strongly the importance of challenge and, I guess the perceived and natural risk around that, and, the kids are having that experience of having to resource themselves and equip themselves, and maybe they set out thinking I'm going to do it in a day and it ends up taking 2 days, or, maybe you're going to light a fire, or no, you're not because it's wet, or, the matches got wet, or all of those little things, and you realize that, you know what, like you don't always get to pick your challenges, and by virtue of, you know, life isn't this amazing mum or dad character that's always going to look after you, that actually, you know, we're preparing you for a world that is an amazing, exciting place, but it's also a place that's quite impartial and may not always look favourably upon your very best efforts. It's a tough lesson for kids, but it's important that we give them those contexts and those experiences.
Absolutely. And the other thing I'd say also, which something that's kind of I've learned, I reckon, over the past sort of 3 or 4, 5, 6 years, as we're starting to look at things like entrepreneurship, is the role of a mentor and a helper, and providing students with, you don't want to give them the answers, but if you can provide them with a template or a map that they can navigate their way through a challenge, I think it's really important. And I think, you know, asking for help and mentorship and these sorts of things, I think are really, really important. Again, back to that skill thing, are really important character traits or skills we want to impart to our students.
Absolutely, and it speaks to that networking a bit, doesn't it? I mean, you know, having that, you know, the uncle or the aunt or the, you know, the older sister or brother or whoever, and just again, how often, you know, I love my myths and stories, but you know, how often in stories that, you know, someone just appears, like the stranger turns up and happens to be not needing this particular thing that's exactly what the person needs at the time, and it can be a friendly piece of advice or something else. I remember a teacher, actually, just a very quick digression. I think I've shared this story with you before. His name was Clive French, and he was a teacher, a history teacher as well. And I remember I was having a very down day, and I was glumly walking in, you know, all of mid-20s, you know, like world on his shoulders type thing. And you know, Frenchie asked me, he said, "Oh, you know, Swanee, how you going?" And I said, "Oh, I'm struggling a bit today, Frenchie." And he just looked at me and goes, "Character building."
The old-fashioned tough love sometimes, you know, that's what's needed.
Yeah, it just made me laugh, and I just thought, oh God, yeah, it's so true. You know, it's so true in that. So, Ross, I'm interested in your thoughts. You know, again, and it's one of the things I know I would imagine as a headmaster that can be hard, and that is getting the mix between, you know, the carrot and the stick with kids, because sometimes, you know, we're talking about the world being at times an impartial judge and doesn't always look favourably upon things, but we have rules to govern us, and that we need to know not only their boundaries, but there's rules, and rules organise behaviours and enable us to function as a society. If I was a parent listening to this and I was thinking, God, how strict do I need to be with my son? Like, do you have any sort of, you know, what's the Ross Featherston sort of headmasterly rule of thumb for rules and discipline?
Yeah, it's tricky, and I think if there are parents who have got young children listening to this, I think you've got to start young. I think it's the Jesuits that have the saying, "Show me the boy at 7, and I'll show you the man." You know, in the series 7 Up and all that sort of stuff. So start early, but it's about setting boundaries, having clarity about what those boundaries are, and having clarity about what are the consequences if the boundaries are overstepped. And it can be as simple as how much time can you spend on the Xbox, through to, you know, when boys and girls get a bit older and they start going out and parties and 18th and that sort of stuff, through to, you know, what time are you to be home, or what time are we going to pick you up from the party you're at? So it's, in some ways it's simple in terms of setting boundaries and reinforcing expectations and those sorts of things. But in some ways it's difficult, isn't it? When you've got a 16, 17, 18-year-old, you know, son or daughter, it can be tricky. But I think it's about, again, starting these things off, you know, early with your children. Don't be I call them no, yes parents. You know, you say no, and then you say, oh yeah, okay, it's too hard. Go on, off you go and do whatever you wanted to do. So I think it's about, you got to hold the line, and but at times you got to give a carrot too. There has to be a reward if, and I'm not advocating, you know, get an A+ on your English exam and I'll buy you a surfboard sort of parenting. I'm not advocating that at all, but I do think there needs to be balance. There needs to be opportunities for boys and girls to be rewarded, in inverted commas, for their good work, and if they're doing things right without overdoing it. You know, you don't have to necessarily reward someone for doing something that they should do, but there does need to be a balance. But I acknowledge at times it can be difficult. And I, referred to Rosie before, my wife. Between her and I, we're probably a pretty good team with our kids. She tends to do most of the she's probably got a firmer hand than I do. But I think as I said, it's a bit of a balance. And acknowledging that it's not easy and it can be difficult.
And and the timing, that's the thing that I think a lot of people have spoken about is, picking your time as to when you hold and when you fold with certain conversations. One of the strategies that we often talk about is, set up a conversation and have the conversation in a couple of days, or look for your moment, or know when to raise things. And sometimes in the heat of the moment, it's actually not the best time, and you actually need to tactically ignore it.
100%. I mean, and again, specifically to boys, I think with teenage boys, there's as you say, there's a time to go and a time to sit, and sometimes those times will present themselves in moments when you don't expect it. But when you have a moment, when you've got your son, you've got his ear and he's open, that's the time to dive in. It can be when you're sitting in the car, sitting side by side, not face to face. Some of those little things, and you just got to know when. Use your intuition a little bit as a parent to know, okay, I've got a bit of a window here that I could have a conversation that I wouldn't normally be able to have, so I'll jump in. Yeah.
Over time, and obviously being a parent, and your oldest is getting towards the latter part of secondary, I guess that informs your headship and your practice and your professional work as well. For parents listening, do you think there are like key milestones or key sort of moments, for boys as they grow up, and if so, what might they be?
Look, absolutely there are. And I think those milestones need to be, recognised, celebrated and honoured. Otherwise they can pass and they're gone. And I think some of the traditional milestones are still here, first day of secondary school, first day of high school into year 7. And that's one of the great shames of what we're currently living through, isn't it? That our year 7s really it's been difficult for them to enjoy that milestone year of their first year of high school. And then it's age and stage stuff, so maturation stuff. Year 7 we've already mentioned, then into year 9 and 10 when that maturation starts to kick in, maybe even a little earlier. But it's around that, getting to 16, then you start to, you get your L plates, you're able to drive. And then obviously the big one is 18, leaving school. And I think that, as I said before, I think, good schools recognise and celebrate and mark those milestones. And my experience tells me that if that's done well and in an authentic manner, boys will really respond well to that. You can't let these sorts of things, Ray, we have a thing from year 9 and year 10, then into year 11. It's marked by a new blazer, by a blazer that the year 11s and 12s get to wear. Just little things like that I think are really important. You've got to put a lot of thought to them so that they're not seen to be false by the boys, but definitely those sorts of things need to be marked and celebrated. And then it's the more informal things. It's a big deal, isn't it, for a boy when he's, and I'm talking perhaps more as a parent here with my second son, the first time he gets picked in the 7A cricket team, wow. And I know your son with his rugby, the first time he's in the first 15 rugby side, or getting the lead role in a production, or, being acknowledged for something that, so there's an acknowledgement piece in there as well. I think one of the things as teachers, as educators, as leaders and parents as well, I think, don't forget what it's like to be that 12-year-old boy who's been picked in a particular team or has gained a role in a particular thing. It's a big deal for a 12, 13-year-old boy to do that. And the more we can mark and honour and, celebrate those sorts of things, I think the better.
Absolutely. And it speaks a little bit to what you were saying earlier about being seen, just how important it is to be seen for who you're becoming. And you were saying earlier about finding your true north. And these are, I guess, the moments that we discover that, and that they're witnessed by us as parents. And, parents will always play, such a vital role, even as we become adults and, head towards our 50s, and that, still, the role of the parent still continues to be as being seen, for something. I know I still, when Mum says something positive about me, I still think, that's all right. Thanks, Mum. And so on. Ross, one other question I had for you, in the parenting space, you've talked about, these key milestones and acknowledging, kids. At the moment, is there anything particularly relevant, do you think, for if I was listening to this, and again, we're still in the COVID phase, and, a bit of hope or a bit of wisdom for parents who are sort of in that space and still trying to, work out what's next? What would you say is the most important thing to focus on?
You mean in the current sort of
in the current climate,
COVID environment as a parent? Yeah, I think there's a whole bunch. Keeping everyone in a routine, having conversations. I think patience. I think we've got to be a bit patient, a bit more patient perhaps than normal. Kindness, I think, is really important. We've got to be kind to ourselves, but also kind to the other people living under our roof, our families. One of our counsellors here, head of our counselling service, she's got a fantastic line, and she uses the airline mask analogy. When you're in the aeroplane, put your own mask on first, and then put others around you their and it's so true in terms of that well-being piece. We've got to look after ourselves first and foremost, and that enables us then to look after others better. And for parents, I guess, from an educationalist, for want of a better term, perspective, I think don't be too worried. Some research, we know that there's some research from other societies and other people. The Christchurch earthquake stuff, for example, is one that springs to mind. That from an educational perspective, whilst the students at the moment are missing out on quite a bit in terms of what goes on when they're normally at school, from a development perspective, what we know, and we're pretty confident that they'll be okay. That there might be some short-term little gaps and things that need to be filled in and plugged, but I think the kids will be okay. So parents, don't be overly worried, don't be overly stressed. As I said before, my grandmother would say, keep doing your best, be patient, be kind, look after yourself. But the kids will be okay. I'm an optimist.
What is it to be a good man these days?
Yeah, we've already touched on some of these things, haven't we? We've spoken about being true to yourself, being comfortable in your own skin, acknowledging differences, and it's more than acknowledging, isn't it? Embracing diversity and recognizing that each person's an individual and these sorts of things. But beyond that, I think a lot of it comes back to that service bit, serving yourself and your family, and that's really important. But serving others, serving something bigger than yourself. Some of the traits we've already spoken to a little bit around, showing emotion, being authentic, not necessarily conforming to what society might or has, thinks a good man is. It's not being the biggest and the strongest and driving the best car and those sorts of things. Humility, I think, is really important. Being gentle, being kind. But as pinching a bit of Steve Biddulph's work, it's the heart and the backbone thing, isn't it? We want our boys, our young men, to have heart. We've spoken a lot about that. But at the same time, we've also spoken about being resilient and standing on your own 2 feet and finding a way through, and that's the backbone bit, because the world can be tough out there, and you've got to be able to show a bit of strength and a bit of steel sometimes, whilst at the same. So I think and again, I'm pinching it from Steve Biddulph, but you can't go too far beyond his one of his great. What's the word? Not lines, but one of his great, paradigms, I guess, is developing young men with heart and backbone. I really like that.
If you had a story that you could tell a boy of 14 and he'd listen, what would the story be?
Yeah, you won't be surprised with this, Ray. You love your classics. I love my history, and I cannot go past. If there was one thing I could tell a 14-year-old and he'd listen, it'd be the story of Lincoln, Abraham Lincoln. Not so much Abraham Lincoln's rise to power. Many of us know that about. The son of a farmer, and he was a log splitter and all that sort of stuff, rose to become the greatest president of the United States, probably one of the world, history's greatest leaders. But it's more what he did during his tenure as president, and it's captured. Movie recommendation, if you haven't seen it, Spielberg's Lincoln film. It's a fantastic film, tells a great story, which is the story that I would tell a 14-year-old boy. And that is, Lincoln holding the United States together during the Civil War, the unbelievable pressure he was under as a leader to do that. And he led, as I mentioned before, he led in the past. He obviously led in the present, with hundreds of thousands of Americans killing each other during the Civil War. But he also led in the future, around the Emancipation Proclamation, freeing the slaves, and these sorts of things. So there was that public, his role as president. I don't think a president or any leader really had been under that sort of pressure that he was under during that time. But then there's the thing that a lot of people don't know about what was going on in his personal life. His son died. He lost his 10 or 11-year-old son during that period when he was president. His wife had mental health problems herself. Lincoln had mental health. Nowadays he would be described as having depression. He called it the black dog. But through all of that, he managed to maintain his sense of humour. He was able to maintain somehow, I don't know how, but he was able to maintain his equilibrium and didn't lose sight of what he was there for. And I guess ultimately he paid the ultimate sacrifice because he was killed having just been re-elected for a second term. He was assassinated, as we know, and died just as the Civil War was coming to an end. And for a 14-year-old boy, sometimes their eyes can glaze over when we tell them stories from history and about these sorts of things. But I think there's some real grit and depth in the story of Lincoln during that sort of 4-year period when he was in power. And I'd like to think that in telling that story to a 14-year-old boy, and he'd sit there and listen to it, that he would make of it what he would. But ultimately what he would get out of it is this sense of, again, I've mentioned before, but this sense of serving something bigger than himself. And how much I love my history and these sorts of things. It is as I said, it's a tremendous story, and one that the depth, a lot of people wouldn't know the depth and the things that sat behind it in terms of what Lincoln endured. And it's a story, as I said, of resilience and hope, but ultimately it's a story of incredible sacrifice. So if I had one amongst many, Dr. Swan, that would probably be the one.
And a great place to leave things today, Ross. Thank you on behalf of our listeners. Thank you for your time. You've given us an enormous amount to think about. I think for those of us that know you, we're so grateful for the work that you do, the way that you lead, the example that you set, and from all of us here at Understanding Boys for the wisdom that you've just shared. Thanks again, Ross.
Pleasure, Ray. Thank you.
We hope you've enjoyed this Understanding Boys podcast. Make sure you subscribe on your podcast app, and please leave us a review to help grow the community. For more information about the podcast, please visit understandingboys.com.au. Until next time, thanks for listening.